You are watching In Conversation This Week with Miceal O'Hurley.
Greetings, this is Miceal O'Hurley. Welcome to another edition of In Conversation This Week. Today we have as our honored guest, Miss Ayla Bakkalli, who is the Crimean Tatar Representative at the United Nations, the Indigenous Peoples Council, and she's also a consultant to the Ukrainian government. Ayla, welcome to our program.
Thank you, Miceal, for having me as your guest today.
Absolutely, we're glad to have you. I've invited you onto our program today because it's kind of a sad anniversary, but it's one I think our viewers will be interested in. It's the 18th of May, 1944. Tell me what's happening to the Tatars in Crimea.
On May 18th, 1944, 4 a.m. in the morning, in the wee hours, when everyone is sleeping, the knock on the doors of Crimean Tatars with soldiers in front of their door, unexpected, they are confronted with Soviet soldiers. And they do not know what to make of it. Other than that, there is an immediate instilling of fear. They are told to gather their belongings in 15 minutes. You have elder people, you have children, you have newborns, you have mothers to be who are pregnant, you have the ill. They are gathered in central locations of the village in which they are rounded up, placed on tractors, and placed on different modes of transportation and taken to the train station to be loaded on cattle train wagons and shipped off to Central Asia, Siberia, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, all remote places of the world. This was a tremendously tragic moment in the Crimean Tatar history, and the deportation has really placed the modern identity of the Crimean Tatars with the en masse deportation by Soviet Russia on this horrific day.
Bring us up to date. A lot of people aren't knowledgeable about the indigenous people of Crimea, the Tatar community. Who are you, and why were the Soviets so afraid that they had to deport you to the far-flung places of the Soviet Union?
Well, the Crimean Tatars are an ancient people, and they have a long, extended history with Crimea and the link to Crimea. If you can recall a little bit of history, if I can recall, one of the famous statements of Gregory Potemko in the 18th century, in which he makes a statement to his mistress, Catherine II, and says, "Imagine the Crimea is yours," in 1782. "And the wart on your nose is no more." And it is Russia's imperialistic and colonizing approach to Crimea and to the Crimean Tatars that have inflicted this tragic history. It is a imperialistic narrative, and that projects that continual projection to permanently annex Crimea. The sequence of events the first annexation occurring in 1782, and the sequence of events of thereafter is the Soviet deportation that I've just mentioned to you. It's very interesting that the Crimean Tatars have always felt their identity with their land. It is an indigenous root. We identify ourselves as roots with the Scythians, the Huns, the Kipchaks, the Khazars, the Turks, the Tatars, the Kievan Rus, and all these multitude of people that have come to form what is today the Crimean Tatars. So it is a very ancient rooted a connection. And the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issue holds an annual event in which all Indigenous leaders gather together to also explain their story, how they became Indigenous. So becoming Indigenous means that your land has been taken away from you, that attempts to erase your identity is constantly being enforced. So all these acts by a very imperialistic policies by imperialist Russia, continued thereafter by Soviet Russia, and now today the Russian Federation has come full circle into permanently rid of the Crimean Tatars from their homeland. Crimea, if you take a look on the map, it's very strategically located. It is a peninsula that's connected with the Perekop to mainland Ukraine, and the Russian Federation in 2016 built an artificial bridge connecting the Kerch Straits with with Russia, and so to its mainland, in order to create a continuity of land. And so when we look at the map of Crimea, it exudes out to the Black Sea. Then the Black Sea, the navigational water exudes out to the Bosporus, which then goes out to the Dardanelles, and then goes out to the Mediterranean and out into Aegean Sea, right in the backyard of Europe. So the strategic location of Crimea is truly something that I think that when we talk about Crimea, we need to take a look at the map and realize why Russia has consistently throughout history used Crimea as a springboard to further its conquests into Europe and Middle East. And if we can just recollect, just a few years ago, after Russia occupied Crimea, then it launched many of its operations into Syria. And it could not have done so without Crimea. The militarization of Crimea is also a very, very urgent and critical issue. Ukraine signed the Budapest Memorandum in 1994 and rid of its nuclear plants in exchange in recognition of its sovereignty and territorial integrity, which Russian Federation completely has disregarded.
When I look at the map, I don't see any contiguous land access from Russia to Crimea. Crimea is connected to Ukraine. Am I correct about that? Before the artificial bridge in 2016, which came after the Russian invasion of Ukraine and Crimea, there was no access from Russia to Crimea. Am I correct in that?
Absolutely correct. It wanted to minimize it. It just wanted to change the geography through its occupation, because the Crimean Peninsula is connected by the Perekop Straits to mainland Ukraine. That is correct.
The Russian involvement in Crimea is relatively recent. It started with Catherine the Great. It ended at the collapse of the Soviet Empire. And then Russia reinvaded Crimea in 2014. Do I have those facts correct?
Yes.
Why is it, do you think, that Russia believes they have a rightful ownership to Crimea?
You would need to look at the Russian history. And if you look at Russia's history, you could see that many of its policies are imperialistic through conquest and through multiple land grabs in its history. Ukraine does not have an history of imperialization. Ukraine, similar to the Crimean Tatars, have been also the victims of Soviet communism. Ukraine had the 1933 Holodomor, and the Crimean Tatars had the 1944 deportation. And if you look at the geography of Russia, it lacks warm ports. It does not have access to the sea. And given its desire to strengthen itself within the energy sector, it needs navigational waters to transport the energy to European markets and to other markets out there. So Crimea has been always the target for Russia throughout its history in order to use it as an access, as a warm port and access to other ports to transport its goods.
Ayla, you touch on a very important point. Russia's attempted illegal annexation of Crimea, this temporary occupation of Crimea, puts it in a position not only to have access to the naval base, but to transportation, to warm water ports. And correct me if I'm not wrong, tell me about the natural resources, including oil, that Russia now has access to because it's temporarily occupied Crimea.
Russia does not care about the people of Crimea, does not care about the environment of Crimea, nor does it care about the destruction that it causes to its environment in commercial building and in also as well as its total disregard to the people of Crimea. Russia has its initiative to be again find relevance after the fall of Soviet Union, and its relevance is through the energy sector. It is also has access to the Caucasus, and it also has access through Chechnya and Dagestan to the Caspian Sea. And now it has its position in Syria, and now comes to its completed objective in occupying Crimea, and to use it as a springboard, as a launching pad to further make its entry point into Europe. it's very hard to understand why Europe has not seen that perhaps its national security is immediately placed at stake when Russia occupied Crimea. And the tepid reaction to it is quite surprising, because if you recall, during the ensuing Soviet years, Turkey was sitting at the edge of its seat, and Western Europe as well, as to when and if Soviet Russia would make further incursions into Europe. And that has been always the fear. And with this illegal temporary annexation, that same kind of sense of urgency in Europe is not, we don't see enough of it expressed out there.
I can understand your frustration. I do want to point out that Ireland, thanks in no small part to the efforts of the Chargé d'Affaires Olena Shalaput at the Ukrainian embassy, Ireland has been at the center of opposing the Russian attempts to illegally annex and occupy Crimea and eastern Ukraine. We have voted in the UN continuously to condemn the Russian actions, called them to leave Crimea, and impose sanctions. So a lot of us here in Europe do understand that the Crimean Tatar community has suffered immeasurably. There are more than 13,000 Ukrainians dead after the Russian invasion of Ukraine's eastern provinces and Crimea. There's 1.5 million displaced people in Ukraine and Crimea. And this brings me to my next point. The Russian government has boasted that it's issuing Russian passports to people in Crimea, a strictly illegal practice as an occupying force. It has affected the Crimean Tatar community acutely. Please tell me about what's happened to your properties that you've only gotten back since Ukraine's independence. Where do you stand today? What's happening to the Crimean community of Tatars today? And have people lost their properties, their livelihoods, and their lives because of the Russian occupation of Crimea?
The Crimean Tatars have been and the Ukrainian activists have been the preeminent opposition against the illegal annexation of Crimea. And I would say it has been noted that approximately 50,000 Crimeans have left the peninsula, and a majority of them have been Crimean Tatars. So there are numbers that are quoted out there that reach 25 to 30,000. Those who have left Crimea have left again their belongings, and they have left their houses. Some of the Crimean Tatars' relatives are taking care of the existing houses that they have. The situation is quite difficult. For the Crimean Tatars, there is no freedom of expression. There's no freedom of movement. There's no freedom of association. There's no freedom of media. There's no freedom of journalists. And at the pretext of these illegal seizures into Crimean Tatars' homes of so-called extremists, they have created a sort of a scenario play that they are really defending themselves against extremists. Crimean Tatars have never had extremist positions in Crimea. And also, faith for Crimean Tatars have been more of an identifier of tradition and culture, and not a dogmatic belief. It's a purely faith in God and in their tradition through that. So there have been disappearances of Crimean Tatars, extrajudicial killings, torture, ill treatment, and they have been continually are being documented by Crimea SOS, a Ukrainian NGO organization that had a very, very effective role on the initial stages of 2014. And among other organizations, also the Freedom House, the Human Rights House as well, and the Crimean Human Rights Group have continually kept an account of all the human rights violations, the persecution, and the political prisoners that they have held. So it's not good for the Crimean Tatars. They do live in fear, and the passport situation is very difficult because they are Ukrainian citizens and they are not given a choice. They are not given a choice. Crimean Tatars, through their very hardship, returned after the en masse deportation during Ukraine's independence, which number around 300,000 who have returned. And now they find themselves in a position where through those long, hard years, they have built homes, they have built lives, they suffered in that process, and they achieved a lot as well. And to leave Crimea once again, psychically, it's very difficult. And it's very reminiscent to the 1944 deportation as well. Some have held the Ukrainian passport, but it's very difficult to navigate. You cannot assume positions in the government. You cannot assume positions in the academic field. You cannot assume any livelihood without a Russian passport. So, but the overall prevailing sentiment of Crimean Tatars that they are hanging on and they are in their homeland and they are waiting for us, the Crimean Tatar diaspora and the Crimean and Ukraine to along with the Crimean Tatar leadership and self-governing bodies, the Mejlis, to help regain and deoccupy Crimea so that they can resume their lives under a Crimea that is within Ukraine, as it was during those ensuing 30 years of freedom. So it's hard to predict, but there is an initiative which is the Crimean platform that is that came to be as a response to the occupation of Crimea. It is also a response to the international community that Crimea will not be a frozen conflict as is and continues to be Ossetia and Abkhazia. And the Crimean Solidarity Group, which is a civil group that came to be formed purely out of the people who are very conscious of and principle-minded of what is the right thing to do. They formed organically to protect those Crimean Tatars and Ukrainian activists who were being abducted and imprisoned for opposition of the occupation, purely on a political stand. The Crimean platform that is now being really is now truly a very big focus of Ukraine and also the Crimean Tatars. It is an initiative that the National Security Council Ukraine is working on a comprehensive de-occupation strategy, and that is where the focus should be. But Crimea SOS, the Crimean Tatar Mejlis, and Ukrainian NGOs are keeping an account of all the human rights violations that are occurring on a daily basis in occupied Crimea.
Ayla, I want to touch on two issues very quickly. We're short on time, and I appreciate your patience. And the first one is, you used the term disappearances. Can I ask you directly, aren't we talking about the murders of people who we will never see again?
Yes, yes. We want to use a term that's, I suppose, that hopeful, because we're also worried about the parents, the mothers and fathers who really are hopeful that one day their sons would be returned. So in that respect, we want to honor those parents. And but absolutely, the disappearance are murders. There have been numbers that are out there. It's about 40 or so, and there are close to 214 political prisoners who are in horrendous conditions and in Crimea. And with the ensuing COVID pandemic, we don't know about their situation. And in addition to that, they're horrific conditions, and they do not also adhere to the political prisoners, who are also mostly Muslim, to their dietary jurisprudence. They serve them pork, and which is very difficult during the Ramadan. Some have fasted, and perhaps this might not be a very dire situation for others, but it is a very, very dire a situation, and not enough media exposure has been given to the Crimean Tatars. That's why the Crimean platform will be is so important, because it's also an international instrument to consolidate all the international efforts and to bring intergovernmental parliament members, experts, NGOs, and different players who have been very active throughout these ensuing occupation years, who have been defending the Crimean Tatars and also being their voices out there for them.
I appreciate the wealth of information you're giving us. Unfortunately, this is one of those topics that requires a deep dive. That full information you're giving us, it kind of defies the glib one-liners, the sound bites that too often dominate the media. And that's why I appreciate your willingness to be with us. If I seemed insensitive by being direct about disappearances being murders. You've got to forgive me. My work in El Salvador, my work in Bosnia tells me that too often these euphemisms become excuses for the world community not to sit up and take notice. So if I seemed insensitive, please forgive me. I just wanted to highlight what is happening to the Crimean Tatar community and the insults they suffer by not being fed halal food, and purposely being fed pork is an insult. Let me ask just a couple more quick questions before we go. I want to talk about someone who I've seen talk several times and I'm inspired by. And forgive me if I don't get his name correctly. It's Mustafa Dzhemilev. He is the leader of the Crimean Tatar movement. Am I correct in that?
Yes, you are correct. He is the leader of the Crimean Tatar people to this day.
One of the things that I heard him talk about is he was only a toddler in 1944 when the NKVD, what later became the KGB and is now the FSB, came to his parents' door and gave them a few minutes to pack what little they could carry on their backs and leave. And he spoke about having a bag of flour, which the mother distributed to the children slowly, and it kept them alive. And he talked about being expelled from his homeland in Crimea rather passionately until he could return at Ukrainian independence. Under Ukrainian independence, thousands of Crimeans were able to return to their homeland in Crimea. What was that experience like?
To get a sense of how the experience was like, you would now have to go back to 1944. And at that time, just imagine that there are no Crimean Tatars left in Crimea. They rid of all Crimean Tatars, and they were replaced by Russian ethnics. So they had to populate the Crimean Peninsula. And in order to do that, they replaced Crimea with Russian ethnics, and Russians went into the Crimean Tatar homes, placed themselves there. And to this day, the population statistics is 58% Russian ethnics. And during the return, at the time of Ukraine's independence, 12% of Crimean Tatars represented the return, and 28% are the Ukrainians. So here you have a population statistics who are in the majority due to the population replacement with the colonizer, with the Russian ethnics. So therefore, when the Crimean Tatars returned to Crimea, they faced tremendous discrimination by the Russian ethnics, and all the false propaganda that ensued throughout the Soviet years that they have arrived to take away their homes. So the return and the settlement of Crimean Tatars in the Crimean Peninsula was very difficult because of the majority of the Russian local representatives in the communities that they have lived had more allegiance with Moscow than they had with Kiev. So this dynamics reflected in the daily lives of Crimean Tatars, if they wanted to gain a home, if they wanted to buy a home, if they wanted to have a job, if they needed to go to the hospital. So in that respect, it is not Ukraine who has inflicted the deportation. It is, as a matter of fact, Ukraine has identified the 1944 deportation as genocide. And it is Ukraine who has recognized the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. And several days ago, as just mentioned, that President Zelensky has now issued a decree, and an urgent one at that, and which is currently registered in the parliament, that on this day of remembrance of the deportation on the rights of the indigenous people. So it really defines the Crimean Tatars as indigenous Ukrainians and as the Crimean Tatars of the Crimean Peninsula. So I think that when we look at the Crimean Tatars tragic experience, and here you have the largest Russian ethnic population in Ukraine, which is in Crimea, and the interface between the Crimean Tatars and the Russian ethnics during Ukraine's independence has been one of conflict, have been one of challenge. And the transference by Russia that Ukraine has not treated the Crimean Tatars well is another fake news and another propaganda. It is not easy to resume one's lives when you return, because Ukraine was a transitional nation from a communist to a democratic one, and it has lived several revolutions. It continually rejected Russia's initiative to colonize Ukraine as well. So there are two tiers of colonization here, one of the nation of Ukraine and one of the indigenous people. But the Orange Revolution came immediately after that, during the Ukraine's election process between candidates, one loyal to a pro-Moscow faction and the other one for an independent Ukraine. These are all transitional processes that these former Soviet communist nations ensued. So I think we have to keep that in mind. And after the Russian Revolution, there was another, which is, you had Maidan, which is the revolution of dignity. Again, Ukraine pushing back Russia's attempts to again colonize Ukraine. So I think this speaks to also another very important, I think, issue that the international community or EU does not look at, and which is that how does Russia identify itself? Ukraine clearly identifies itself as an independent, a democratic nation. But what is the identity of Russia? Okay, the identity of Ukraine is Kievan Rus, but it cannot be the identity of Russia. I think it's an issue of self-identity. Is Russia's self-identity Ukraine, where Ukraine has its own identity, its own traditions, its own history, its own intellectual framework, its own psychic of how it sees itself as its own social ethos, how it sees itself. And we are the indigenous Ukrainians, the indigenous people of Crimean Peninsula. So I think that this is something that when looking at the temporary illegal annexation of Crimea, we have to revisit this, because the damage of Soviet communism, which erased individual identities, individual traditions, individual national identities, need to be revisited And by Russia, we know some of the incidents that occurred of recent of its people also trying to find their own identity.
So let me ask you very briefly, as an indigenous person of Crimea, is Crimea Ukraine?
Yes.
You're in an elevator with the international community. You've only got a few floors to go up. What would you ask of the international community?
I would ask the international community to place pressure on Russia to deoccupy Crimea immediately, and that that in fact to abide by to implement the international laws, and that Russia needs to adhere to. I think in one word is that Russia must leave Crimea. With Russia in Crimea, the Crimean Tatars have no future.
We've been talking to Ayla Bakkalli, who is the Crimean Tatar Representative to the Indigenous Forum at the United Nations. We've heard about the dire situation under which the Crimean Tatars are living and suffering. We've heard about the 1944 expulsion, the return upon Ukrainian independence, and then Russia's invasion in 2014, bringing the cycle of violence against the Tatars full circle. I can only wish you well, Ayla. My heart goes out to the Tatar community, and I want you to know that there are those of us in Europe who understand that Ukraine and the Tatars are standing as the bulwark against further Russian aggression in Europe.
Thank you very much. And don't forget, Crimea is Ukraine.
There you've heard it. Ayla Bakkalli, Crimea is Ukraine. This is Miceal O'Hurley. Thank you for joining us on In Conversation this week. Find us on Facebook and Twitter, and take care. We'll see you soon.